Okay, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started here. And we're talking about bones. So we're going to go on. We've gone through the mineral makeup of the bones. We're going to look at bone growth and we're going to go from there and see where this takes us. Anybody have any questions on anything at this point? Okay, then we're going to get started. A reminder that lab this afternoon, if you haven't had lab yet, lab will be dealing with the skeletal, the muscles that are going to attach to the skeletal system. So, okay, so let's get into this. And let's see. So what I want, sharing, start over, just give me a second. Okay, here we are. This is what I want. So now we're going to talk about how we get to a full skeleton. Let me back up a little bit here. Just a little more. So we start out with a skeleton that is fully made 6 weeks after conception. The process of laying down our bony skeletons will occur then. Let me back up a little bit. So we are conceived. We have an egg and a sperm nucleus fusing together in the fallopian tube of the female. And from there, we have one cell that grows very rapidly into well over 150 cells over the course of a week and becomes very organized and differentiated into what it's going to become. That's what implants in the wall of the uterus. It takes about 7 days from the point of fertilization to implantation inside the wall of the uterus. Now, in that time, in the next 5 weeks, we're very, very busy. Our heart forms and starts beating after 3 weeks. So we have a heartbeat. We can't detect it yet at 3 weeks, but it's there. And we're laying down our skeleton. We're laying it down made out of hyaline cartilage, so it's soft tissue, but we are forming our arms and leg bones, our hands and the bones of our hands and feet, the girdles, the skull, all of our bones are being laid down mostly as hyaline cartilage. In a few places, just going to be membrane. Once that skeleton's in place, we are about 6 weeks old, after 6 weeks from the point of conception. 6 weeks. We're about 1 inch in length, and we have a full skeleton in place. And then we begin the process of ossification. That is, converting that cartilage and membrane skeleton into a bony skeleton. Because right now it's a cartilage and membrane skeleton, mostly cartilage and a little bit of membrane. And we start the process 6 weeks after conception of ossification, the creation of the bony skeleton. And the process will continue of ossification will continue until we're about 23 years of age. And then when that stops, when the ossification process stops, then we continue with our remodeling and repair processes, because we're always reshaping our skeleton based on the demands we're placing on it. In fact, we have completely replaced our entire skeleton every 10 years. So it's a very dynamic process going on here. So, and it all starts, well, it actually all starts at the point of conception, because the instructions are in place already in the DNA to tell which cells are going to become cartilage cells and how they're going to become calcified and become bone cells. So, but it's all laid out there. So 6 weeks after conception, we start ossifying our hyaline cartilage skeleton to make it a bony skeleton. And that moves fairly quickly, but it isn't all completed for the next 23 years. So we continue the process of, so we have a 6-week-old embryo. We're about an inch long. We have a full skeleton in place made out of cartilage and some membrane. And then we start replacing the cartilage. The process here is called endochondral ossification. The cartilage bones, they're still considered bones, even though they're soft. Their hyaline cartilage is soft and flexible, but we still consider them bones. We call them endochondral bones. Most of our skeleton, in fact, 99% of our skeleton is made out of endochondral bones. Everything except the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, the temporal bone, and the clavicle are going to be made out of hyaline cartilage. Those 4 bones plus of the skull plus the clavicle are made out of a fibrous membrane, and they're going to become ossified through what's known as intramembranous ossification. But the bulk of our skeleton is going to form. The bulk of our bony skeleton will form through endochondral ossification, replacing the hyaline cartilage with bone. Essentially, all of the bones are going to be formed through endochondral ossification, except the skull bones and the clavicle. I don't know why the clavicle. Skull bones make sense because the brain has to continue to grow inside the skull, and the skull has to have some give to it. And so the membranes allow this give as the brain develops. So we start 6 weeks after conception. We follow the model of the hyaline cartilage skeleton that's in place. We have what's known as a primary ossification center that forms in the middle of the long bones, the long cartilage bones. We form an ossification center, and we see the formation of osteoblast cells in these ossification centers. And the osteoblast cells, are going to lay down matrix. And then they're going to get trapped in the matrix and become osteocytes. So we start out, we form a ring around the long bone. We form a bone collar around the middle of the long bone, and we start forming matrix, osteoid there, thanks to the presence of the osteoblasts that have developed. So this ring, this collar, this ossification center forms around the shaft of the cartilage bone. We start seeing calcification take place. The cartilage here at the ossification center is becoming calcified. We create spongy bone, and then we see the formation of the osteogenic cells and the osteoclasts and of course the osteoblasts, and we start forming the medullary cavity, and more importantly, more interestingly, we form secondary ossification centers at each end of the long bone. We have the primary center starting in the diaphysis in the middle of the shaft. At the epiphyses, we form secondary ossification centers, and those are going to last. Those are going to last for 20-some years. Now, the primary ossification center will go away because the shaft will form, but where the epiphyseal centers are located, those become the epiphyseal growth plates that allow our bones to lengthen and to grow longitudinally over our early adolescence and early adulthood. They're going to finally close around age 23. And when we reach, when we reach adolescence, the only places where we have cartilage remaining are going to be in these epiphyseal growth plates, and they're going to get really, really active when we hit puberty. and we're going to have growth spurts in here, and then we're going to see they will eventually shut down also until all we have left is an epiphyseal line, and there is no more longitudinal growth. Longitudinal growth stops at about age 23, but then we will continue to remodel, and we'll have what's known as appositional growth, which is side-to-side growth, because our bones will continue to remodel themselves and change their shape over and over and over again based on the demands we apply there. So you can see, if you really want to look at these little tiny pictures here. Here's our hyaline cartilage bone we start with. We start getting a growth center in the middle of the shaft, and we start laying down the matrix here, in which we see calcification of the cartilage. We see the secondary growth centers forming here in the epiphyses, and those are going to become the epiphyseal plates, which are the growth plates, which are going to stay there and be active for a long, long time. And then eventually they close too, and we're done with the growth of our skeleton as far as longitudinal growth. You know, when the epiphyseal plates close, we're finally at our adult stature. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to remodel. Now, this is what we look like at 12 weeks. Remember, at 6 weeks, we are about, probably the size of a grain of rice. And yet we have a full skeleton in place and a heart that's beating. At 12 weeks, we are about an inch long. And we have, you can see where the skeleton is located here. The skeleton is showing up here on X-ray. You know, where you see bones is where we have bony cells, where these bones have calcified. You can see the ulna and the radius, you can see the femurs, you can see the ribs, you can see part of the pelvic girdle in place. You can see the scapula, and you can see the parietal bone and the frontal bone and the occipital bone in the skull. Now, what you don't see doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It means that the rest of the skeleton at 12 weeks remains as hyaline cartilage. So we haven't completed the ossification process. Remember, ossification of long bones, of our bones, takes a long time, 23 years. Now, most of this will be done by the time we're born. We'll have our carpal bones and the rest of our metacarpals and our phalanges in place. The ends of the ulna and the radius and the humerus, all that will all be in place for us. It's there now. What we don't see it as is because soft tissue doesn't show up on the X-ray. But this is at 12 weeks, we look like this. The membranes here are forming. Remember, now they're going to take longer to close because we have the soft spot, the anterior fontanelle, up here at the top of the skull. And so that soft spot is made up of these membranous structures, these fibrous membranes that are eventually going to calcify and close. But our skull bones have to allow for growth, the growth of the brain. And our brain grows faster than the rest of our body does during development. Our heads are always bigger than our heads are always disproportionately larger than the rest of our body, and our body catches up to it. So this is us at 12 weeks. Here we see us at 10 weeks. Not as much growth, not quite as much ossification is taking place here yet. You see more spaces between the bones. Well, there's cartilage in there, hyaline cartilage, and membranes here. Ossification isn't as far along at 10 weeks. But one of the things that you do see is that all of our structures are already present. All of the fingers, all of the toes, all of the bones are already there. The ulna, the radius, the humerus, the ribs, the pelvic and pectoral girdles, the tibia, the fibula, the femur, the tarsal bones, the metatarsals, and the phalanges are all there. Everything's there. It's just growing. And so while we are very small in size, we're completely formed at this point. At the point that we're converting our skeleton over to bone, we're in the stage of growth. Developing new tissue is is occurring, but everything, we are growing. Anyway, now the so intramembranous ossification works a little bit differently. In here, we're going to see more diploid type bones created than compact bone, but we're going to have these membranes that have formed over the brain. The membranes, the parietal membrane, the occipital membrane, they are essentially the basis, the framework for the bones of the skull, and they're going to ossify also, just like at the same time that the hyaline cartilage skeleton is going to ossify. We have ossification centers inside that form in the membranes, and we see these stem cells that are present here turn into osteoblasts, bone building cells. They release matrix. The matrix calcifies. We form trabeculae. We form the periosteum, and we start laying down lamellar bone. We start laying down osteons where necessary. But we end up laying down a lot of diploid, because all these flat bones of the skull are diploid anyway. Strength without great strength without a lot of weight. And it looks, if something like this, we end up with a lot of diploid type of form. We have our osteoblast forming here, laying down the compact bone on the outside with the spongy bone inside here. And we end up with these bones of the skull that have formed with compact bone on the outside, spongy bone in the middle, and another layer of compact bone. And there's still a great deal of flexibility because those membranes don't close completely and ossify completely for a long time. And so we have the give that we need to allow our brain to enlarge and get bigger. I guess that's redundant, as we grow. Once we reach our adult stature, longitudinal growth stops. Longitudinal growth is the up and down, the vertical growth that we see, the long bones and lengthening, if you will. Once that stops, all we have now taking place is what we call appositional growth. The thickness of the bone increases. The appositional growth is in response to stresses. The more you exercise, the more you work your muscles that pull on the bones, the stronger the bones are going to get and the thicker they're going to get. So you have appositional side-to-side growth in response to those demands. If you have few demands on those bones, because you have few demands from the muscles on those bones, then the bones are going to get weaker. They're going to get thinner. They're going to get lighter. They're not going to have a great deal of strength attached to them. So we always try to strike the balance between too thick and too thin. While we say that all of our bone growth stops once we hit, once we finally complete adolescence, our facial bones, some facial bones will continue to grow very, very slowly throughout our entire lifetime. The nasal bone is one of those. Nasal bone, for whatever reason, the nasal bone continues to grow slowly. And in some people, their noses get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. It happens. The forehead, the frontal bone may enlarge over time. That we see that frequently too. But normally we're not going to have significant changes in our bone structure after the longitudinal growth stops. Now, there are going to be exceptions. There are going to be pathological conditions that can occur, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit. So, okay, now. So this is bone growth here. We see there's our epiphyseal plate. When it's open, we have longitudinal growth. You know, this vertical growth here as the bone lengthens. But once that closes, we get appositional growth on the sides. We can enlarge, you know, side to side, horizontally on the bones, but not vertically anymore. And this is, this is the growth plate. This is a section of the growth plate here, showing where we start out with the hyaline cartilage here, and we end up with becoming bone cells down here. And this is what occurs. We have an epiphyseal plate that is open until we're about 23 years of age. We have hyaline cartilage gradually, hyaline cartilage cells being converted to bone. On X-ray, that shows up as a dark line. If the epiphyseal growth plate is active, because soft tissue doesn't show up in the X-ray. Once it closes, you get a bright white line on the bone, because that's where the calcification has finished. And so you see either a growth plate or a white line. The growth plate means that growth is still taking place. A white line means that adult stature has been achieved. And so always the line is just the remnant of the growth plate. If you were working in forensic science and you were examining a skeleton that you had been brought in, and you would take X-rays of the skeleton to try to make an assessment of the age. And the first approximation that you could get would be if the growth plates had closed or not. If the growth plates hadn't closed, then it would be likely under 23 years of age. And if they had closed, it was over 23 years of age, or early 20s. So that's a good approximation of age right there. Now we find, that what is the trigger for growth, particularly during adolescence? Now, growth hormone sort of gives it away there. Growth hormone is the number one hormone responsible for bone growth. That's what it does. It stimulates bone growth, among other things. But it will be active. Bone growth occurs throughout infancy and childhood and adolescence and puberty until early adulthood. We're constantly secreting growth hormone in sufficient quantities so that we will continue to grow. It's when we hit puberty that we have our rapid growth spurts. Now, in addition to growth hormone, we have to have available energy. Our metabolic activity has to be adequate to support growth. And this is where thyroid hormone comes into play. Thyroid hormone regulates our metabolism. And if we release lots of thyroid hormone, our metabolic rate goes up. And if we don't release a lot, our metabolic rate goes down. So during puberty, we release a lot of thyroid hormone, and so that we can eat more food and have more energy available to us for growth. And so it works together with the thyroid hormone, with growth hormone, to maintain growth and development. And when we're kids, we're told, eat your food, you want to, they'd say, you want to grow up to be big and strong or tall or whatever, whatever parents say. And to us when we're kids, we, in one ear and out the other, but that's just the point. Whether we listen or not, we eat food and we grow in stature. The food provides the nutrients, it provides the energy that is regulated by thyroid hormone, that we use that energy combined with growth hormone to grow. Now we get our growth spurts, and those growth spurts occur because of the release of the sex hormones. The estrogen and testosterone are going to stimulate bone growth. We see, all the secondary sex characteristics appear during puberty. We see the enlargement of the long bones. We see the increase in muscle mass in here. And growth then stops when the testosterone eventually, when the levels of testosterone in the male become sufficiently high, they will induce the shutdown of the epiphyseal plate. The same is true in the female. When estrogen levels finally rise to adult levels, just like testosterone in males, it will cause the shutdown of the epiphyseal plate. So any problems with growth hormone or thyroid hormone can alter the growth of our skeleton. We'll see later on here something known as pituitary dwarfism, where insufficient growth hormone is being released and your individual does not achieve a stature usually greater than 4 feet, at least naturally. Also, there's a condition known as gigantism. Gigantism occurs when growth hormone levels are very high, even in infancy and childhood, and so your individual can easily achieve a stature of over 8 feet. So now the triggers at puberty, of course, are the sex hormones. The sex hormones are going to regulate or determine our growth. The coming off of our adrenal glands are a series of hormones called androgens. Androgens mimic, or essentially are like what we'd say the non-specific sex hormones. In males, androgen is essentially testosterone. In females, androgen is testosterone, but it is essentially it is converted, the androgens are converted to estrogen in the female. So the release of these androgens from the adrenal glands, and I'll think about this for a second. We need our sex hormones to trigger puberty, but we don't get we don't get sex hormones from the ovaries or the testes until they develop. So unless they develop, we can't get the sex hormones, but we release the androgens from the adrenal glands, and that triggers puberty. And then the ovaries and testes can develop. These androgens become estrogen in the female and trigger the development of the ovaries, and they are essentially testosterone in males, and they trigger the production of testosterone in the testes, and that then triggers all of our growth spurts and development of secondary sex characteristics in the males and females. The growth spurt actually ultimately works against continued growth, because as our levels of estrogen rise, they will eventually shut down the epiphyseal plate when they reach a certain point. Same with the testosterone. The estrogens close down the growth plates earlier than testosterone does. So a female usually starts puberty about a year before a male does, maybe 2 years before a male does. And the estrogen will trigger rapid bone growth. So they have the growth spurt. The female will achieve her adult stature very quickly, but the high levels of estrogen that are being released from the ovaries when they've developed and the adrenal glands ultimately cause the growth plate to shut down. So a female, puberty starts earlier, and she will achieve her adult stature earlier than a male will. She'll grow rapidly, reach her adult stature, and then stop growing. So, whereas the male, first of all, puberty may not start for a year or two after the female, and the buildup of the testosterone is slower than the buildup of estrogen. And so the male will have their growth spurts and reach their adult stature. And then they will shut down their epiphyseal plates, so that there's no more dramatic growth. And it takes, again, the final shutdown of the epiphyseal plate doesn't occur till about 23 years of age, with minimal growth taking place here. But we've achieved most of our adult stature by the time the dramatic growth has stopped. And so the epiphyseal plates are going to shut down. Now, something else estrogen does is estrogen does stimulate osteoblast activity. So this is very important for the female, because the estrogen will continue to stimulate osteoblast activity, and will you'll see as bones remodel and get replaced, there's plenty of estrogen available to do that. But when the female hits menopause and the ovaries shut down, the amount of estrogen left in her body coming from the adrenal glands are not adequate to support strong osteoblast activity, bone buildup activity. And so a female that had a postmenopausal female will often experience osteoporosis if she has not maintained a diet, high in calcium, throughout her life. If she maintains a diet with the recommended levels of calcium, high in calcium, leafy greens, dairy products, and exercises her body. When she hits menopause and she shuts down her ovaries, and there's no more estrogen coming out in sufficient quantity, then she can become a candidate for developing osteoporosis. There are many postmenopausal females well into their 80s and 90s that have no osteoporosis whatsoever. Osteoporosis is not what's going to happen to every postmenopausal female. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that a percentage of females that did not have sufficient calcium in their diet, did not take vitamins, did not exercise properly, had poor dietary habits, or maybe they did everything right and they still developed osteoporosis. It's just some things you can't predict. Without estrogen present to stimulate osteoblast activity, those individuals that are going to likely be a candidate for osteoporosis. But many other older females, postmenopausal females, don't develop osteoporosis. Anyway, now the sex hormones, very similar in structure. They're of course they're derived from cholesterol. They're all steroid hormones. They're very similar in shape and structure. Just a few differences in the shape of the molecule determines what they are and what they're going to do. So, but it isn't just estrogen, testosterone, and growth hormone. We have insulin available. Insulin, did you know that insulin, and this always, I'm always reminded of this every time we go through this, insulin also stimulates bone formation. So, and why do we release insulin? When we have, when our blood sugar levels go up, so we release insulin. That, in addition to bringing the sugars into the cells, it also stimulates bone formation. a hormone also released from the adrenal glands called glucocorticoid will inhibit bone breakdown, osteoclast activities. The glucocorticoids inhibit bone breakdown. So we don't just use growth hormone and thyroid hormone and sex hormones. We have insulin, and we have the glucocorticoids like cortisol at use here. And as we'll see this in AP2, that it isn't just all about insulin. You know, we have numerous other hormones that help to regulate blood sugar levels in our bodies. So, but now, as far as the calcium levels go, the two hormones involved with that are what's known as parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone are antagonists. You know, they're sort of, if you heard me talking about antagonist muscle groups in lab, you know, they work against each other. Well, the same thing applies here in hormones. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are antagonists. They work against each other. Parathyroid hormone breaks down bone to release calcium. Calcitonin builds bone up to capture calcium. So they work in opposite directions. Now, our skeleton is the source of calcium in our bodies, and we need lots of calcium for muscle contraction. Skeletal muscle depends on lots of calcium. So does cardiac muscle. We depend on calcium, the presence of calcium for nerve impulses. We depend on calcium for blood clotting. So there's a lot of uses in our bodies for calcium, not the least of which is having them in our bones to make our bones strong. When we need calcium for these other actions, our bodies will raid the bones. That's what they do. And the two hormones that help to control absorption of bone to release calcium or deposition of bone to capture calcium are going to be parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. And these, you know, we use these hormones all the time. We are, because see, we're recycling our bones on a constant basis. You know, about 5% of our total bone mass gets recycled into new bone every week. We replace all of our spongy bone every 3 years, and we replace all of our compact bone every 10 years. So we can say we have a brand new skeleton every 10 years. And this remodeling process involves deposition of bone and resorption of bone, sucking up the calcium or laying down the calcium. Bone deposition, laying down calcium. Bone resorption, sucking up the calcium. And we do it at the periosteum site, the site of the periosteum, and on the endosteum. And we end up using osteoclasts and osteoblasts together. Osteoclasts are going to tear down bone and release calcium. And osteoblasts are going to use that calcium as they lay down new osteoid, forming the hard matrix. So they're going to have a side-by-side process. Sort of like when you see road construction taking place and they're tearing up old asphalt, you have that big grinder and it comes down the road and it's chewing up the asphalt, the old asphalt, and throwing it up into the back of a storage tank behind it. And then the paver is coming along behind the grinder and laying down new asphalt on top of the cleaned surface. It's sort of like that, you know, where they go, you know, they have this continual process of tearing up, laying down, tearing up and laying down. Remodeling of our bones takes place continuously. We control it through the use of our hormones. We use negative feedback to control our calcium levels. And we see all the things that calcium is important to us for. Our bodies will not hesitate to go after the calcium in our bones to get what we need for nerve transmission, muscle contraction, coagulation of blood, for secreting hormones, from secreting other substances directed by our nerves. And we even use calcium in cell division. So we regulate our calcium levels in our bodies with calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. To get more calcium into our bodies, we have to absorb it through our gut. We have to absorb it from what we eat and from sunlight. And the only way we can absorb calcium is from vitamin D. We make vitamin D we get vitamin D in our diet. We get vitamin D from sunlight. Sunlight indirectly contributes to our absorption of calcium. Vitamin D is made in our skin. Vitamin D allows us to absorb calcium in the gut. So sunlight lets us absorb calcium. So vitamin D is what we need vitamin D to allow us to retain calcium from our small intestine, to have it be absorbed through our small intestine. Vitamin D comes in dairy products. Vitamin D comes from exposure to sunlight. We form vitamin D in our skin. Vitamin D comes in vitamins. We take vitamins, and vitamin D is usually present as one of the vitamins in a multivitamin. So our remodeling of our bones is very much controlled by our hormones, very much controlled by our hormones. But we also respond to stresses to remodel our bones. It isn't just about the constant routine maintenance, laying down a new skeleton every 10 years of compact bone and every 3 years for spongy bone. This is just the normal wear and tear routine maintenance. But we also have to respond to stresses. We have to respond to mechanical stress. That's the other thing that triggers remodeling of our bones. So we'll get to the stress here in a second. Hormonal controls. Calcitonin. Within the thyroid gland, there are cells called parafollicular cells. And the parafollicular cells produce calcitonin. Calcitonin stimulates deposit of calcium in bone. So if we have high levels of calcium in our blood, this is what we're measuring, is blood calcium. High levels of calcium in our blood, calcitonin will be released from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland and stimulate depositing calcium in new bone. We will essentially trigger osteoblasts to make new bone. Calcitonin is not a very important hormone because we very rarely have high levels of calcium in our blood. So it is not a key hormone. It's an antagonist to parathyroid hormone, but we very rarely release it because we are nearly always, rephrase that, we are usually not in a state of excessive calcium. Usually our blood calcium levels are normal or low. So calcitonin doesn't get to do a whole lot for us. It's, as we say, it's not a major player in this. Parathyroid hormone, on the other hand, is the #1 key player in regulating blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone made by the parathyroid glands. Now the parathyroid glands show up, they are 4 tiny little glands embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. They're about the size and shape of a raisin. There are 4 of them. They produce parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone gets released when blood calcium levels drop down below normal, below I get to say homeostatic levels. When we drop down below the normal range of calcium in our blood, then the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone, which stimulates osteoclast activity. The osteoclasts start dissolving bone and releasing calcium. When our calcium levels go back up, we stop releasing parathyroid hormone. This is the key player here. Parathyroid hormone is always being used because our blood calcium levels are always going to be either normal to low, because we're always using calcium for other things. We're always using calcium for muscle contractions. We're using it for nerve impulses. We're using it for blood clotting. We're using it for muscle contractions, nerve impulses, blood clotting. What am I missing? Well, those are the big three: muscle contractions, nerve impulses, and clotting. Oh, and mitosis too. So, but the big three are going to be muscle contractions. Lots and lots of calcium used in skeletal muscle and in cardiac muscle. Lots of calcium used in generating nerve impulses. Calcium is used in the whole clotting sequence. We've got to be able to clot. And so our calcium levels in our blood are always going to be either normal to low. So we're always going to be using parathyroid hormone to break down bone. This is these are negative feedbacks. This is calcitonin, the negative feedback. Remember now calcitonin is not a major player, but this is how it works. If our blood calcium levels go up above normal levels, then we will release calcitonin from the thyroid gland, from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. That will shut down osteoclast activity. We're not going to dissolve bone for a while. And it will stimulate osteoblasts to lay down new bone. This doesn't happen very often because we're very rarely in a position where we would have excessive calcium in our blood. The parathyroid hormone, on the other hand, is important. It is also classic negative feedback. Blood calcium levels drop. They're always dropping in our bodies. We're always, either low normal, or below, or too low. Oh, let me get back. I didn't do this one yet. There are the 4 parathyroid glands in the posterior surface of the thyroid. They're a separate gland. They're small. They're about the size and shape of a raisin. The parathyroid hormone only gets released when our blood calcium levels get too low, and they will trigger the release of more calcium into our blood. So first of all, and parathyroid hormone does 3 things. It will inhibit osteoblast activity and stimulate osteoclasts to start dissolving bone. So the first thing it does is just shut down bone making and stimulate bone breakdown. Okay, that's so we can dissolve bone and release calcium. That's what we want to do. The second thing is it will tell us to absorb more calcium in the small intestine. Of course, that requires vitamin D. But that's what we'll do. We will absorb more calcium in the small intestine. That's the second thing that parathyroid hormone does. Remember, it's all negative feedback loop. We respond based on low calcium in the blood. Negative feedback. We got to reverse the stimulus. So we do. We reverse the stimulus back to raise our calcium levels up. So we're breaking down bone using osteoclast. We are absorbing calcium at greater levels in our small intestine, and we are retaining calcium in our kidneys. And parathyroid hormone drives all 3 of these activities to raise the calcium levels in our blood. And when the blood calcium levels come back to normal, then we stop making parathyroid hormone. And this is our flow chart. You'll see this now. You'll see it again in AP2. But there's our stimulus. Our stimulus is low blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid glands. It stimulates the inhibition of osteoblasts and stimulates the activation of osteoclasts, causing the breakdown of bone. This is the osteoclast side over here. Osteoclast production increases and we dissolve bone. That's the first way we get more calcium. The second one is we absorb more calcium from the small intestine, thanks to the presence of vitamin D. And the third thing is we stop releasing, we retain more calcium in our kidneys. We stop peeing away calcium. And so our blood calcium levels go up, and that stops this classic negative feedback. Our calcium levels, though, are very, very important to us. They are regulated. We don't want to see a lot of changes. There are two conditions that can occur, either hypocalcemia. Hypo means we have too little of something. Hypocalcemia, we don't have enough calcium. We become hyperexcitable. Too little calcium causes our muscles to contract and our nerves to become overstimulated. And we don't like that. And we can't revert back to our normal state because we don't have enough calcium. Hypercalcemia ends up causing non-responsiveness. We have so much calcium that our muscles contract and won't let go. That our nerves will generate a nerve impulse and won't generate another one. Or we clot so well that we form more and more clots and we die. Well, all three of these are going to have bad endings if we have excessive calcium. On a smaller scale, excessive calcium can lead to kidney stones. We can also see calcification of valves in the heart, excessive intake of calcium, sustained levels of calcium. The woman I used to work with years ago would eat, I'm sure I told you about, she would eat a bottle of Tums, fruit flavored Tums, just about every day. I don't know if I told you this or not. When I shared an office with this woman who had this obsession about Tums, fruit flavored Tums. And there was a Costco like a block away from where we worked. And so she would go up there at lunchtime every day and buy a jumbo sized bottle of, how Costco sells stuff and like Sam's and the jumbo sizes. And she'd pop them all afternoon. And whatever she didn't eat that day, she'd finish the next morning. Tums are nothing but calcium carbonate chalk with fruit flavoring in there. They work as an acid reducer in your stomach because the calcium carbonate is a base and it neutralizes the acid. That's what you're supposed to do with it, and take one or two every several hours, not one or two every couple minutes. And she was building up her calcium levels excessively. I left. We worked together for about 10 years, and I never knew if she was having any kidney problems or not. But she was a candidate for kidney stones at the very least because of all this excessive calcium. We don't like that. We don't want to become hypocalcemic or hypercalcemic. Both of them, as we'll discuss extensively in AP2, lead to bad outcomes. So now, other hormones that play a role here, leptin, released by our fat cells. Leptin may inhibit osteoblast activity. We're not certain about that, but it may affect bone density. So individuals that have lots of lipids stored in their adipose tissue may be releasing leptin and altering their bone density. Or it may work the other way, where you have very little lipids present in your adipose tissue, and the leptin is being released and inhibits osteoblasts. So, because if you inhibit osteoblasts, you are going, you're not, if you're inhibiting your osteoblast, you're not going to build your bone, and you're going to get weaker bones. Bone density will decrease because your bones will get weaker. That's what happens. That's what we see happening with our bones if we don't have enough, if there isn't adequate osteoblast activity going on. And we don't know that. The first indicator that we might have a problem with osteoblast activity is when we stand up and our leg snaps, or you try to open a door and you snap a bone in your wrist, where a normal activity causes a fracture that shouldn't occur. So, and we don't know if it's because of the increased presence of lipids in the adipose tissue or a decreased presence of lipids. We just don't know. Another hormone that gets involved here is serotonin. Serotonin is what we call a neurotransmitter. We'll discuss that in a couple weeks here. Neurotransmitters are the link between nerves and muscles, and nerves and glands. They're they're like a chemical messenger. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that has a lot to do with mood and balance, but it also interferes with production of osteoblasts. So a lot of how our mood and the amount of sleep we're getting may determine how strong our bones are too. Yeah. Stresses. We've gotten through all the hormones here, now stresses. There is only one law that you need to learn in AP1. I don't make a big deal about learning these laws in here, but there is one law that affects us. And this is something that you'll see all the time in play in healthcare. It's called Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law states that bones grow or remodel in response to the demands placed on them. Now, what's that mean? Well, we know that bones are going to stress when a load is placed on them. When a muscle pulls on them, when a load is placed in the bone will respond. The more a muscle pulls on a bone, the stronger the pull of the muscle, the greater the stress that the bone experiences. The bone will remodel itself. It will grow and remodel in response to these demands. The more stress you put on a bone, the more the bone's going to grow. The bone's going to remodel itself and get stronger. The more pressure you put on the bone, it's going to grow and enlarge and get stronger. The less demand you place on a bone, the less stress is placed on a bone, the less force that's placed on a bone, the less weight that's placed on a bone, the bones are going to get weaker. Wolff's Law says that bones grow or remodel in response to the demands placed on them. They get bigger and stronger when you have great demands, like weightlifting or exercise or strenuous activities. They get smaller when there's less demand. When your patient is bedridden, chronically ill, when they don't exercise, when they don't maintain good calcium in their diet. Wolff's Law says, again, bones will remodel in response to the stress. They will grow, they will remodel, they will shrink. Remodeling, I guess, covers shrinking. So anyway, this is Wolff's Law. The greater the demand, the more the bone's going to change. If the demand is greater stress, the bone's going to get stronger. If the demand is less stress, the bone's going to get weaker. Bones tend to get thicker on the shaft where the stresses are going to be the greatest. So we see Our bones are going to enlarge. If you decide that you want to be a weightlifter and your goal is to lift 1,000 pounds, and so you are exercising every day, lifting weights, and lifting greater and greater weights over time, your muscles will enlarge. Your muscles will not, you will not grow new muscle cells, but your muscle cells will get bigger. More protein will be added to those cells and they will enlarge, and your muscles will get stronger, and they will have greater pull on your bones. And your bones will respond by getting thicker and bigger and stronger themselves to deal with the stresses of the muscle pulling on it. And that's what will happen. And if you've achieved your goal and then you stop lifting weights, then the muscles will start shrinking back down, and the stress on the bones, the force on the bones will drop, and the bones will shrink back down. Wolff's Law has a role in helping to determine the strength of our bones if we are right or left-handed. The upper limbs of the dominant hand are going to become thicker and stronger because we use it all the time. So we see our muscles get bigger when we have greater demands. We see them get smaller when we have fewer demands on here. This is Wolff's Law, all in all. Think about, I'm probably going to say it ahead too soon here, but think about astronauts in the space station, that are up there for days, and not these little, like when Elon Musk took William Shatner up the other day for 5 minutes. Not that kind of flight. I'm talking going to the space station, staying there for 3 months, or 6 months, or a year. Now, you're in the space station. An astronaut is in a weightless environment. The force of gravity is canceled in here. Now, gravity, of course, is not our friend. Gravity pulls on our bodies all the time. Our bones here on Earth have respond to our movement. Plus, they also have to respond to the force of gravity pulling down on us. We're not aware of gravity, but it's there. We know gravity's there, and it pulls on us, and our bodies respond to that force pulling on us. Gravity's not our friend, in a lot of ways, but gravity pulls on us. Now, that's a force applied to our bones, and our bones are sufficiently strong enough so that we can continue to walk and run and sit and stand and talk and move and manipulate our environment despite the forces of gravity pulling on us. Go to the space station. There's no gravity. You can float. You can, you've all seen video of astronauts in the space station floating in their weightless environment. That affects their bones. But eliminating that force pulling on their bones causes their bones and muscles to get weak. Now, granted, they will exercise. They use resistance equipment like Nordic track and stuff like that in Bowflex, but they can't exercise 24 hours a day. They can only do that for a few hours a day. And ultimately, what happens is your astronaut will lose bone mass. If he or she is in space for a year, they will lose bone mass over time because there's no gravity pulling on the bones. There's no gravity putting a force on the bone. And Wolff's Law says bones respond to external forces or the absence of external forces. So no gravity, bones don't have to work as hard, muscles don't have to work as hard, bones don't have to work as hard, and we lose muscle mass and we lose bone mass over time. And so the longer you're longer you're an astronaut in the space station, the more muscle mass you're going to lose. You're not going to lose muscle cells. You're going to lose mass of those muscles, and your bones are going to get weaker. Okay. Mechanical stress works through the generation of electrical signals when our bone actually is, deformed, if you will, as they say here. When we are applying force to a bone, it is altering the shape of the bone. That creates an electrical signal to stimulate bone deposition and bone growth. So, mechanical stress tells us where to grow new bone. Hormonal control is regulated, but mechanical stress tells us where to do it. We certainly don't want to stimulate the release of growth hormone to have greater bone growth throughout our bodies. If you're lifting weights and you want to have very strong bones in your arms and in your legs, you're not so concerned about the shape of your head or the shape of your vertebrae or something like that, or the bones of the inner ear. You're concerned about the strength of the arm muscles and the strength of the arm bones. Now those are going to grow. The forces arrayed against the bone will trigger where we're going to have new growth taking place. So bone remodeling will always occur. We can alter that by our activities. Bone remodeling occurs at a faster rate if you're a weightlifter, because you're or if you work in a very strenuous physical occupation, like being like a server. Servers are very stressful and very strenuous. Healthcare providers can be a very physically demanding occupation too. Bones will remodel based on that. If you decide you really want to be an astronaut, if you have a patient that's an astronaut, or if you know someone who is an astronaut who's been in space for long duration flights, they will frequently lose muscle mass and bone mass. And I've read that they never truly recover 100% of what they lost. So, for what that's worth. Okay, now, let's talk. I think we have time to finish this section on fractures. Fractures are breaks in the bone. If you've ever broken a bone, or two or three, it usually occurs from some type of trauma, whether we fall down or we get injured playing contact sports, or sometimes we just do dumb things. Because nobody ever deliberately sets out to break a bone. So most of our fractures have occurred through trauma, but in elderly people, the fractures usually occur because the bones have become weakened. The bones are very strong, but they cannot resist all compression, all twisting, all sudden impacts. You walk into a table at night and you hit the anterior crest of your tibia, and it hurts. We call it the shin bone, and it hurts because that sharp edge doesn't like to be bumped into something, but you didn't break it. You fall down and you get up, and you're, other than maybe a little embarrassed or annoyed, you didn't break anything. But sometimes you get, you run into things that you didn't expect. You slip and fall and land awkwardly. You get, people get car doors shut in their fingers all the time, or they play contact sports and break bones there. Things happen. Stresses from unusual directions or forces more than the bones can withstand are going to cause fractures. And there are a variety of fractures that we can encounter. Fractures get classified by what happened, what did the bones do? Were they knocked out of alignment or not? We look at, are the bones in place or are they not in place? Are they non-displaced? Are they still in position? You know, if you break your radius, is it still lined up? Is it a fracture all the way through? Is it displaced, or are they, you know, is it in place, lined up, or are they knocked out of alignment? And you have to realign the bones. And that's what's known as setting the bone. Is the break complete? Is it all the way through the bone, or is it incomplete? You know, children are good for breaking bones incompletely, and that's good. You know, they have a type of fracture known as a green stick fracture, where it doesn't break all the way through. It's easy to treat. Is the skin torn open or not? Is it a compound fracture, meaning is the bone torn? Has the bone torn through the skin? Or is it a simple fracture? Is it a closed fracture? The skin is not penetrated. You know, so the ideal fracture, of course, is to have none, but an incomplete closed fracture that's non-displaced is very, very easy to treat. You know, that's the kind of fracture you have if you've ever broken one of the phalanges in your finger. It doesn't penetrate the skin, it's not out of alignment, and it's usually closed. And all you can do there is simply tape the finger that's fractured to the finger adjacent to it, and leave it taped up with maybe a small splint on it for several weeks, and it'll heal. There's not much you can do to it or for it. It'll heal up on its own. Remember, all of our fractures do heal. All fractures heal. Sometimes they may not heal the way we want them to because we didn't align the bone correctly, but all fractures will ultimately heal. Here's a variety of fractures we see. We see an open fracture. This is a compound fracture and it's displaced. We see penetration through the skin. A green stick fracture is what children tend to have, where the bone is soft enough that it won't snap completely. We call it green stick because if you try and break a stick off of a tree, it doesn't break easy because it's green. A comminuted fracture, lots of pieces laying there. Don't like that. A linear fracture, this is what we usually get if we have a fracture in one of our phalanges, like you get your hand, you shut the car door in your hand. You know, it happens. Transverse fractures, straight across, oblique fractures diagonally, spiral fractures. The bone has been twisted. You know, football player places their foot in the ground to make their cut, make their turn, and their body turns and their leg didn't. And so you had this spiral fracture around the tibia, and it looks like this. Cole's fracture and pot fractures here. We see a break on the fibula and a tear of the tendons over here. So these are different types of fractures that can occur. So worst fracture ever. You know, every time I go through this, I always look for some of the more interesting, best word I can say. This is a floor gymnast. I think it was the last Olympics. You'll notice her legs are bending at the knee the wrong way. And look at the shape there of the tibia and the patella. You're not supposed to have a big depression and a groove along there like that, because legs are not supposed to bend backwards like that. She was doing her floor routine and she hit the floor wrong. It happens. So this is in ESPN's Hall of Shame, if you will. Worst fracture ever shown on TV. This was a Monday Night Football game years ago, and the Washington quarterback, you can notice his leg is bending in 3 locations where they shouldn't bend. You know, his femur is being shattered here. So, and it said it was so that the crack was actually heard on TV. You know, so it was the cracking of the femur was so loud. So these are, you know, we can break bones. we don't set out to break bones, but we can break them. So, and this is the last point here. This is the stress fracture of the neck of the femur. This is our hip fracture that we always talk about. The neck of the femur cracks, you know, for whatever reason, usually from osteoporosis in your postmenopausal female. So, and you know, this is the site of the injury right there. So, okay, I'm going to stop us at this, and I will get us out of here. And lab this afternoon, as I said, will be the review of the muscles. So, and if you're in lab today, I'll see you then.